Hello and welcome. My name is Minbaeva. I'm a professor of strategic and global human resource management at the Copenhagen Business School, and I will be your host today. Our webinars are organized in the cooperation of the Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of International Business Policy. We organize a series of webinars with the aim to provide a forum for sharing research insights and discussing its implications. I'd like to thank the co-organizers for this series, Professor Klaus Meyer from the AIB Business School, as well as logistic support from the AIB Secretariat and technical support from Digital Motion. You can actively participate in the discussion by posting your questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. And at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. So you can write your questions there. You can also vote or like the questions. And in this way, the questions will be moved up and we will pick them up in order of their popularity, so to say. Please use this opportunity to engage, and we very much look forward to hearing from you. Today's webinar will discuss the topic, how does global migration impact the cross-border activities of international organizations and multinational firms? My co-host today is Aida Hajro from Vienna University. Aida is an assistant professor at the management department of Vienna University of Economics and Business. And her current research lies in the area of sustainable development with very special focus on the social side of sustainability, specifically migration. In her research, she addresses how multinational corporations tackle migration-specific targets as reflected in Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations Agenda 2030. Aida is also the co-founding member of the network called Migration, Business and Society. It's a global network initiative. We will talk about it also a little bit later. But first and foremost, we would like to introduce our panelists today. So usually we pick up 3 papers for each of those webinars. Unfortunately, our third panelist had to cancel his participation due to serious personal issues. Due to some of that reasons, he cannot be with us. But don't worry, we have plenty to discuss, and I would like to hand over to Aida, who would introduce you to the speakers and the papers. Aida, over to you.
I'm very delighted to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will now give a very brief introduction to the topic, and then I will introduce the papers and the speakers today. So, migration is a pressing global phenomena interconnected with human rights, sustainability, economic development, and geopolitics. Its implications for the private sector, and in particular for the cross-border activities of firms, are undeniable and will remain a top priority for the foreseeable future. So the overall number of international migrants today is around 281 million. If international migrants lived in one state, they would constitute the 4th most populous country in the world after China, India, and the United States, roughly equal to the size of the entire population of Indonesia. However, the situation can be also viewed from another perspective, and I always like to emphasize is the migrant total remains a small percentage of the world's total population, 3.6%, meaning that most people continue to live in the country in which they were born. But there have been changes in migration patterns, and 2 being of particular relevance for international business, so changes in geography and composition of global migrants. Compared with 75 years ago, migrants of today hail from any number of non-European countries and look for new homes in a declining number of countries likely to welcome them. So between 1960 and 2000, in only 40 years, the net emigration countries migrants come from increased from 124 to 148, while net immigration countries migrants go to shrank from 102 to 78. So, and this has resulted in changes to the contemporary context in which multinational companies operate today. What we witness today, and I think this is important, is a multiplicity of countries of origin. Migration scholars call this super diversity, and increased educational levels of immigrants in developed economies. So migrants usually concentrate in cities, in cosmopolitan cities, and we need to keep in mind that also many firms or headquarters and regional headquarters of multinationals are located in these cities. And to give a few examples, Dubai's foreign-born population exceeds 80%. Toronto is nearly 50%, while Sydney, London, and New York are all nearly 40%. And demographers predict that the largest inflow of migrants to cities around the world is yet to come. So keeping in mind that multinational companies employ this very highly diverse workforce. So second implication is that we witness fluctuations in labor supply in emerging economies. This, again, has not only implications for firms, but also for the current reshoring and nearshoring debates in international business. So many multinationals with production facilities in Hungary, for example, are bringing factory workers from Mongolia and Vietnam instead of from neighboring Eastern European countries. And foreign multinational companies in Malaysia often rely on migrant workers from Nepal. So, and I recently heard that there are plans to bring workers from Bangladesh to work in the construction industry in Bosnia, the country I'm from. And they are also important, and I will emphasize this now and later also towards the end of today's webinar, economic, political, and socio-cultural impacts of migration in migrant sending and receiving countries. So change patterns of migration, along with the introduction of new means of communication and transportation, have also transformed the way individuals and institutions are linked across national borders and given rise to new categorization of so-called trans-migrants. Former migrants now fully at home in their new countries, but also linked in numerous ways to their old countries. And this has implications for the cross-border activities of firms, as we will hear now. So, and these new transnational linkages have brought important changes to individual orientations, cultural values and norms, consumption patterns, and processes of economic development in both migrant sending and migrant receiving countries. So IB research community is stepping up and increasingly exploring the phenomenon of migration and its implications for business activities of firms. And now I would like to turn our attention to the two papers. So the first paper, titled Separate but Not Equal Toward a Nomological Net for Migrants and Migrant Entrepreneurs, written by Lisa, Christensen, Ariel, Newman, Heidi and Herrick, and Paul Godfrey, introduces a framework that distinguishes between 4 different types of immigrants and explains how research differences among these 4 types of immigrants might affect entrepreneurship. And our second paper is titled No Place Like Home, the effect of exporting to the country of origin on the financial performance of immigrant-owned small and medium enterprises, will be presented by Sui Sui today and has been co-authored also by Horatio Morgan and Shavin Malhotra. So, and it looks at how socially embedded immigrant owners derive superior performance from high country of origin export intensity. And I would like now to introduce our first speaker, Lisa Johns Christensen, is an assistant professor of management at the Marriott School of Business at Brigham Young University. Her research focuses on antecedents to resilience with a particular emphasis on female entrepreneurship and innovation and entrepreneurship in developing economies. She has published award-winning cases and articles on the topic of resilience, individual organizational learning, and innovation at the base of the pyramid. And Lisa is studying refugee and immigrant entrepreneurship and resilience in refugee and immigrant communities. She received her bachelor from UC Berkeley, worked in Silicon Valley for a decade, and pursued an MBA and Masters of International Development from Brigham Young University. And I would like to now pass the floor to Lisa, please.
Good morning in my corner, and thank you. Of course, thank you to the organizers and to my co-authors and to the attendees. I think this daily becomes a more important question, and so globally important. As you can see by the title that you've heard already, one of the contributions of this paper is that we seek to change from the phrasing of migrant, to problematize, to question that, and to bring some specificity to the topic and to the use of words as we study this very diverse group of people. And so sort of as a prelude to what we believe we'll be talking about today is this first contribution of the paper is to do that, to build this specificity and to suggest and see if you agree and can utilize the determining factors that we create to divide this word migrant into something we can study and become more specific. And we think the value of that specificity is going to be to improve our interventions and our policies and our responses as organizations, as individuals, and of course, as countries and communities. So that's the first part, and we may spend the bulk of time on that because I think that portion will be quite useful to the attendees and is an exciting piece of the paper. Of course, it's not enough to offer an organizing framework. We thought to make sure it was useful to apply it. And in our world, we applied it to the topic of, in our case, refugee entrepreneurship. And so the second half of the paper, after we introduce our typology, we then do the work of using it and showing how it is useful in improving how we respond to, in our case, refugee entrepreneurs. So again, thanks to my colleagues. One of my colleagues is on the screen today, and I of course invite Ariel to join in and contribute where you see fit. I actually believe it is also worth sharing a little bit more about what instigated this paper. I think you'll see this influence and bias, and I think it's important to share it as we discuss the paper. So we were inspired for this paper, as you can see here, by some work and in-depth, really years of working with the Refugee Entrepreneurship Incubator focused on food-based business in a large metropolitan city where we live. And we quickly noticed at a practical and implementation and again, empirical level that the conflation that was happening between, the conflation that was happening between refugees and immigrants in our case was causing suboptimal results for our refugee immigrants. So I'm just going to tease you with that so that you know where our bias comes from. This is not an empirical paper, so there's no data from this. It just will show you when the second half of the paper feeds back to discuss entrepreneurship, you'll see why, and you'll know that we were informed by this particular group. I think that will become relevant shortly. Let's jump into filling your screen with our first contribution, this nomological net or typology. And we would like to thank Dr. Sybil Halbrun, who guided us to look at both refugee theory and acculturation psychology. So to understand this typology, I want to first clarify that we went to acculturation psychology, which management scholars don't often do, particularly entrepreneurship scholars, because that field looks at both new entrants to a community and the existing community members and that interface. And one of the most valuable things that we took from this literature, particularly Barry and Sam, as you can see, is this idea that people arriving and people responding to people arriving likely can be divided in terms of how voluntarily they left their country of origin and their stated and intended time horizon, not what ends up happening, not what we see with interminable camps or people who do not integrate and acculturate. Let's focus first on when they arrive, the time horizon they perceive that they intend to have and hope to have. So given that those are the X and Y axes taken and given to us from acculturation psychology, that immediately problematizes and helps us categorize migrants. And I try to set a timer for my time, and instead it's set for seconds instead of minutes. So I'm going to control that shortly. Thank you. Let's move back to the typology. As I said, it instantly changes this large group of migrants and helps us look at, first, we went at a practical level looking at time. So if you're going to be here for a temporary amount of time, short, you hope to return to your country of origin. That is the lower left, as you can see. And then if you leave intending or force for it to be permanent, that is one axis and the anchors of the continuum. And of course, as you can read, the other area is how involuntarily were you forced to flee. And we think that has everything to to provide this first slice at changing the view of migrants to these 4 categories. So as you can see, the most temporary and the least volition in departing, we use the term exiles. Most people, and the largest number that comprises this group, of course, would be asylum seekers, for example. As we move over on the temporary, with much higher volition, we use this large word sojourners, because as you can already see, this covers everyone from voluntary, international volunteers, missionaries, expatriates, people on foreign assignments, not really the group that we come to meet, but they are migrants. They are temporarily in another place. And of course they do integrate with locals. So I'll be quick to say the rest of the paper actually does not spend time on this group, although we do believe it needs to be defined, and the time horizons and intentions of the people themselves matter as we try to improve our responses and study. But as I mentioned from our practical work, we actually saw this upper row as being so central to the work that we're all trying to do. And that is, there's a large difference from people who are forced to leave and people who have some element of choice. Of course, there is a tight border there. And the end of one group and the beginning of another can be blurry. But we need to begin here, we believe, for specificity in our research and clarity in our responses. And so if you'll bear with me that we'll move past this, if you'll accept it, we do also in the paper really attempt to widen the definition of refugee. I think that bears a few moments at least of talking about. We believe that the UN definition, so widely in use, so easy to take off of the shelf and repeat, is actually not representing the actual reasons and numbers of people who are forced to flee for involuntary reasons. The current definition from the 50s and 1980s included is not taking care of environmental refugees. It's not including a wider range of people forced. And so we also provide, we hope to improve its use, a wider definition. We draw and clarify and recognize an open conversation about how much debate there is about even the definition of refugee and how inclusive that definition needs to be. I thought before we leave, we might share, numbers are both completely dead, but also still informative. They don't invoke the passion or the need and urgency, but also as the difficulty in attaining numbers shows the difficulty that we all face in doing this research. But just briefly, the data we do have shows that, for example, in 2017, 2018, we had 3 million exiles, at least in the category of asylum seekers. Sojourners, you can imagine, is completely the most difficult to track, but we do know we have 900 million international volunteers in that same year. And then Aida opened us with some of the numbers of the groups that have gathered us here, the refugees and immigrants. And she gave us the most updated numbers. So let's move past this first contribution where we needed to start. We needed to clarify who we were studying, and we needed to find a way to open a conversation that had barely begun already about the differences between refugees and immigrants. And after this, as I already said at the beginning, we needed to move it and apply. If this is useful, what does it help us do? How is it useful? Let's apply it to one category of thinking, and that's entrepreneurship. So we had a secondary research question about how differences in voluntary or involuntary departure or arrival impact people's access to and deployment of resources. So immediately, that's why you see the Monopoly board, it became a question of how is this movement or lack of movement or forced movement and these other divisions we're going to talk about, how does that relate to their ability to acculturate and integrate with resources? So again, here's our foundation, but let's clarify some of the definitions in use we have in entrepreneurship. So first we think of it at the foundational level as self-employment in a commercial business. We wanted to leave this very open and flexible. And we assume that the entrepreneurial act stems from individuals doing some of these managing resources. That is why our research question is about resources. If you're going to be self-employed because you have agency and discretion in managing and accumulating resources, how are the differences between refugees and immigrants going to affect, if at all, this entrepreneurial need, ability, and state? So if it depends on these skills, then, and here again, we share for you to read our definition of a refugee entrepreneur. It again focuses on the involuntary nature of departure, and we'll get into details about why that is important. And the plan for permanence, so their time horizon is expected, particularly with formal refugees who will, with enough time and formal support they are given, they're expected to become citizens. So they come in, if especially in formal routes, with this expectation to belong and be in the country for a long period of time. So given that, this is our definition. So an immigrant entrepreneur differs again on that top axis. So moving forward, we've looked at 4 kinds of capital. And the first would be the institutional capital. We are, I'm not going to explain it in detail, but simply it is knowledge and comfort with major, literally, institutions and institutional actors, social structures. And one of our assumptions in the paper and biases is that many refugees are fleeing states with corrupt or incomplete institutions. And so it might be quite foreign, or we at least have this possibility in our work that there is a very large difference from the country that they left and the country they are merging with. Of course, we share these and relax these because we know that in some cases there is not a great difference, but we're sharing extremes to build theory and build a nomological net and build something you can use in your research. So in doing that, and in terms of institutional capital, we did have this foundational assumption, and let's get to our first propositions. It was that as compared to immigrant entrepreneurs, refugees will have more difficulty in navigating and accumulating resources, institutional level resources. What I didn't share with you, because it is super dense, and I ask you to trust in the amount of time that we do have, let me clarify a few reasons for this, a few things that we didn't share when we just jumped to propositions. And partly, as I said, it was this assumption in creating the hypotheses or propositions of extreme difference. But we, for now, you know, the work of the IRC and several scholars in related to refugee theory and policy have shared with us that, let's clarify, refugees cannot self-select where they relocate. And immigrants have choice in our definitions and in the reality of what we studied. So when you have no diaspora to return to, no previous contact, friends or relatives, they typically provide guidance. And so our belief is, if we hold to our extreme cases, that immigrants just have some choice and they might choose to go to where there are moderate institutional designations like green cards that allow certain activities, or they can choose a language and other places where social connection or diaspora are existing and they can get guidance. And so that feeds into all the other forms of capital. Some of those facts about differences, especially once you set up the truncation that we did, you can imagine what that would say about social capital. Social capital, as you know, is not just the connections you have, but how the connections that you have or don't have can be monetized or activated to give you everything from social support that has no financial element to advice. And again, without defining social ties or social networks, if you accept that social capital is yet another resource that can turn into physical capital and can turn into psychological support, we are looking at refugees, again, because of that choice and the lack of preparation and the lack of ability to bring items from home and the inability to return and the fear and trauma we're going to talk about shortly. Those elements mean that it's very hard or harder, where this is all in comparison to immigrants, to form new relationships or to reap the benefit of extant relationships. And so Based on that, you see that as compared to new immigrants, new refugee entrepreneurs will again have a little more difficulty than their counterparts in both accruing and drawing upon social capital. It will take longer to build. We don't think it's impossible, and the odds occasionally occur that there is a social support network in place, especially when institutions like the IRC have worked hard to build them. But again, we needed to build this on the extremes and then move to boundary conditions. So moving on so that we can, in the 4 minutes we have left, cover at least all 4 types of capital. Human capital. As you know, the knowledge, skills, abilities, and health embedded in a person that they can turn to economic value or use in this work of acculturation and that they can provide both to the companies and the organizations and the communities and to other individuals and to themselves. We think that actually this is one of the categories of capital where immigrants and refugees are often conflated, and it is appropriate. It is probably, they will have similar reactions. Language acuity, language match aside, we think refugees and immigrants face similar, sadly, barriers in activating their human capital. If they have, we all, in fact, I don't want to trivialize the common stories of people who cannot benefit from their educational background, from their qualifications don't transfer, their training is not honored, so they can't practice what they know. So they often end up deeply underemployed or unemployed. And that is the harvesting of knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so as you can see here, if we remove the language disparities, then we actually think entrepreneurs who are immigrants and who are at least in the early waves of refugees will have the same opportunities or the same lack thereof. So to just get to the last type of capital, of course, in the paper we have time to differentiate that we do recognize that refugee movement happens in waves, and the first group are more close to immigrants. They have more resources usually than the last people who are able to leave. And so we handle that nuance in the paper. For this overview, I think we'll just move on to the last kind of capital, physical. Given that health was considered a human capital element, this is literally money, cash, and any fungible assets that you have. So we again argue based on just the practical reality we tried to establish. I don't think I belabored it enough in the beginning, that when you cannot bring the assets, when you are often with just what you can carry on your back, we cannot treat this group the same as people who can return to bank accounts, return to their country of origin, and hire friends, colleagues that they trust, that they can harvest their knowledge of all types of capital to wait and reconfigure and think in a safe, comfortable place where they can still make money. That's immigrants. Refugees aren't in that same boat, so they literally do not have physical capital and are often behind in the physical capital because of their journey. So as you can see, we created this typology, and then we charged ourselves with, does this typology help scholars, us first, and our colleagues, and does it help refugees and immigrants? And let's apply that question to the entrepreneurship context. And I probably didn't clarify enough, what we found, as particularly at a scholarly level, was this conflation, except for 2 authors, I hope they're here in attendance, who have consistently fought for these differences. It has been easy in the measurement. It has been unfortunate, but it has been frequent that the groups are conflated. And so one of the best contributions of our paper is to take the arguments of the few scholars who came before us and inspired us, expand it, widen it, speak to a different group, write in different journals, join conferences like this to fight for this disaggregation and the value of it. And what we can do with these propositions is then, what we don't have time to discuss at this first pass, is it can change how we guide institutions to respond, how we guide governments to respond, how we can guide communities and even ourselves as individuals to respond. So what seems obvious when you hear it is not happening in the research, and we need to change that. And that's one of the reasons we're here on the panel And the only thing that I want to say that must be said to sprinkle this and as a thread in our conversation the rest of the day is we think what moderates all of this is trauma. And of course, there's trauma in many immigrant stories and situations, but the statistics are alarming, disturbing, thoroughly established that the refugee journey from beginning to time in camps to the vulnerability and desperation that people feel, the types of trauma and the definition of trauma disproportionately affect refugees, and refugees disproportionately utilize mental health facilities when they arrive, if they have the option to do so. So we believe we need to bring the conversation about trauma to the forefront into the conversation about migrants, because we have separate papers about how acknowledging this trauma is so necessary in our interventions. And acknowledging trauma will also help explain some of the behaviors and some of the needs that organizations can provide and rise to, but we can't until we open the conversation. And it's a hard conversation, and there's a dialectic of wanting to recognize and also turn away from trauma. And I will end on with this final suggestion that one of the contributions of our paper is to introduce this idea that trauma moderates these relationships, and trauma needs to enter into the conversation, and we can do so usefully without re-traumatizing people and without trivializing what's happened, but we need to do it and it can be useful. So Ari, is there anything that you would add as I have spoken quickly and without taking a breath?
No, thank you, Lisa. And thank you again for inviting us to be on this panel. We just, through our practical work with the refugee incubator, that's resulted in this work as well as another publication here, we've recognized how important it is that we delineate between refugee and immigrants and understand their very unique needs. And so we can best help to mainstream new Americans, new Germans, new, Spaniards into our economy so that we can help to integrate these communities in a healthy, sustainable way, and that we can help them to rebuild and to build beautiful lives in their new host country. So thank you again for this. And if you have any questions, we're always open for more conversations, and would love to continue to talk with all of y'all.
So I think you can see me now, my camera worked. I would like to introduce our next speaker. It's Sui Sui. He's associate professor at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. Her research focuses on understanding the internationalization of small business and entrepreneurs. And some of this research has different, she studied how different internationalization strategies, internal resources, and international factors influence firm survival and growth. And also some of this research focuses on how immigrant and women ownership influences entrepreneurs' themes, innovation, internationalization, and financial performance. So its research has been published in top outlets, including Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of Business Venturing, Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. She's serving as an associate editor for the Journal of Multinational Business Reviews, Journal of Comparative International Management, and Transnational Corporation Review. And she's also editorial board of Journal of World Business. So thank you very much, Sui. I will pass the floor on to you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. So let me start sharing my slide. Here we go. Right, so this is a work with my previous colleague, and now they both at University of Hajro and Shavin. And I would say this study is inspired by many friends and relatives around me. Myself, I moved to Canada when I was an international student. As an international student, later on, I decided to immigrate to Canada. And my uncle also, immigrated from China to Canada, and he was a successful business executive in China. And when he immigrated to Canada, actually he was in Quebec. It doesn't speak any French, and he started from scratch another successful international business. So, it's really inspirational. And so, basically I live in a wonderful city, as I mentioned earlier, Toronto, and more than 50%, people was born in Toronto was born from another country. So we do notice a notable recent development in global business that is increasing flow of people across national borders, and especially from developing country like China, India, Russia, go to developed country like Canada is the context of the study, US, UK, Australia. Okay. And this immigrants drive various international business activities, and because they have, many of them have connections, they know the language, culture of their country of origin, so they represent a strategic important talent pool for native owned and multinational business. And many of those immigrants themselves, for various reasons, some of them was executive or entrepreneur before, they don't want to work for anyone else. Some of them couldn't find a job in the country, new country of residence suitable for their talents. And so they, decide to have their own business, right? So many of them based on recent empirical evidence, and they often primarily export goods or services to their country of origin. Okay, so despite this growing evidence of immigrants in international business and the fact they export primarily to their country of origin, there's little systemic theory that explain and predict the determinants of international success or failure of this immigrant-owned business. That is, although they have this, export to country of origin export strategy, but does this, contribute to their financial success? So there's theory have different predictions, and the ownership location internationalization model and the Uppsala model of stage internationalization basic focus the role of firm-specific and country-specific advantages in the international expansion of established researchers, firms. And also there's a dominant international entrepreneurship perspective, such as network-based and institutional theories. They focus either on performance enhancing factors or performance inhibiting factors, such as institutional barriers that immigrant and entrepreneurs might face. So, different theories have different predictions, but did not really answer, whether export to country of origin strategy make immigrant-owned firms financially successful. Okay, so sorry, next page. All right, so in this study, we look into this question, and we propose to use a contingency approach to explain one high country of origin export intensity can be financially rewarding to immigrant-owned SME exporters, small medium-sized exporters. And our contingency approach is grounded in a social embodiedness perspective. We conceptualize the individual level contingency factors in the form of social integration competencies and macro contingency levels in the form of external social integration constraints. So basically, we propose that the effect of SMEs country of origin export intensity, the effect on their financial performance is contingency on 4 factors. The there are 2 factors based on individual level social integration competency. The first one is we believe how long the immigrant business owners stay in their country of residence, how long they be in their new country, because we believe that the longer they stay in their country of residence, and there's more enhanced social integration competencies that can foster their current social embodiedness. So therefore, they're more social embodied in their country of residence. And therefore, we believe that if they stay longer in the country of residence and they have a country of origin export intensity strategy, this have positive moderating effect on their financial performance. The second individual social integration competency we look at is age at arrival for the country of residence. Is that one, how old were they when they arrived the country of residence? And we believe that the younger the younger they arrive the country of residence, they can be more potentially develop social integrations, competencies, and enable current embodiedness in the country of residence. And so therefore we believe that the older they arrive, the less likely the country of origin export intensity have positive effect on financial performance. Okay, so on the other hand, it's the younger they arrive, the more likely benefit from country of origin export intensity. At a macroeconomic level, for the external social integration constraints, we look at the geographic distance between the country of residence and the country of residence. And so we believe the further away the two countries, there's the more the external impediment to current social embodiedness in these countries, and the further away the two countries, there could be higher transportation costs, and there maybe inaccurate information, and also there could be lots of uncertainties the more distance the two countries are. So therefore, we believe the further away the two countries, the less likely immigrant-owned SMEs benefit from country of origin export intensity to their financial performance. Okay, the last factor we look at the external social integration constraint is the institutional distance between the country of residence and the country of origin. And the more institutional distance, things are different. How you do things are different in these two countries, and we believe there's more perceived external impediments and to the embodiedness in the country of residence and origin. And there could be perceived cultural barrier, different culture, communication barriers, or there could be a sense of unfamiliarity. Therefore, the more institutional distance those two countries, we believe the less likely as immigrant-owned SMEs benefit from country of origin export intensity to their financial performance. Okay, so next page. Okay, so the database we use is Statistics Canada's SEED, Canadian Employer Dynamic Databases. And basically this database covers all the immigrants landed in Canada between 1980 to 2015. So all the people landed in Canada as immigrants, they report their age when they're landing, which country they're from. So all the detailed immigration related information, their gender, their education, essential. And we link this database to other database, which has all Canadian foreign tax related data, such as number of employees, profits, payroll sales, location, industry classification, and information on the owners of each business, their ownership share. And also we link to the export data, which is all Canadian merchandise trade transaction, between 2010 to 2015. So therefore, our database is very representative, and we select immigrant-owned SME exporters, and so our database include 584 unique firms and 6,391 firm year observations. Okay, so this is the empirical results. Basically we took into account that there could be endogeneity that for the country of origin export intensity, that is, firms self-select decide how much to export to their country of origin. So we use a split sample instrumental variable to address this potential endogenous narrative. And so if you look at model 3, that is test our full hypothesis. And model 4 is we use space sample analysis to confirm, to check the robustness of the results. Basically, our first hypothesis that years since landing, the longer you stay in country of residence, the more likely you benefit from the high export intensity to country of origin to your financial performance is supported. And the second hypothesis, age at arrival motivating effect, is not supported. Third hypothesis, geographic distance, negative effect on country of origin export intensity on financial performance, is supported. And the fourth one, institutional distance, motivating effect, is not supported. I would mention that our model also include many control variable to address, including the ownership of immigrant owners, the gender of the owner, education, at the firm level, control for firm size, age, export products, destinations. We control for the country of origin GDP, exchange rate between the two countries, immigrant population at the province level, immigrant population growth. And we also control for the self-selection of those immigrant firms decide to export. So we use the inverse Snell's ratio to control for this potential effects. And I guess we have a dummy variable for country of origin, province, industry essential. So our empirical analysis, I believe, is very comprehensive, and you're welcome to read the paper if you're interested. Okay, and so looking forward, I would say our paper, our model data is constrained with Canadian data, and Canada, we have lots of support. Government have lots of support for immigrants and immigrant-owned entrepreneurs. So therefore, our social embodiment perspective is empirically vetted in advanced developed country with sustainable institution support for immigrant entrepreneurs. And therefore, we might not be able to generalize other countries with relatively lower level of support for this, immigrant entrepreneurs. And although our study is focused on business leaders, but we look at small, medium-sized immigrant exporters. So, I think we believe future study could look at, deep understanding of the super diverse, super mobile CEOs, their influence on, attention, those multinational companies, large companies, and their attention pattern, global expansion, and financial results of multinational corporations. And also, this study will look at the financial performance of immigrant-owned entrepreneurs. And, I think, so for the so what question, we can also look at their survival and also their subsequent foreign expansion, whether those consequences, those outcomes affected by their country of origin export intensive strategy. So this is this paper, and thank you so much, and questions are welcome.
So, thank you very much, Sui. I think the plan was initially, I will give one final presentation. I was asked yesterday evening to present also something today. So I worked this morning on my presentation. And then we will go to the questions and answers. And I can see already that there are some very interesting questions in the chat. So I will do, I'm not presenting a paper. I will introduce you to an initiative that we recently launched here at Vienna University. And I'm doing also this because then I will delineate several future research implications for international business, for those international business scholars who are interested in studying migration. Many of my ideas were derived from this initiative. So what is this initiative about? It's called Migration, Business and Society. It's an emerging network of scholars, business practitioners, human rights experts, and policy experts dedicated to the generation, exchange, and dissemination of knowledge on migration, business, and society. So very briefly to the organizational structure of our initiative. We launched this initiative last March here at Vienna University. So it's only 10 months that we have been working on it. So, and I will also introduce you to advisory board members and shortly explain, give details about co-signers. But with the help of advisory board, we hope to generate practice-informed, interdisciplinary in scope research questions on migration, business, and society that will guide future efforts at business schools. Migration is such a complex global phenomena that we believe it requires cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary collaborations to really understand it properly and also to understand its implications for the business activities of firms, but also how firms are currently impacting migration patterns. Our second category are our co-signers. With their help, we aim to strive for concrete impact on practice. And I could see that one of them, Michael Morley, is today attending my talk. So thank you for being here, Mike. So, and we have our endorsers community. This includes business school scholars and fellow academics from other disciplines who have supported the ideas expressed in our position paper and who actively engage with us in knowledge generation and exchange. So if you're interested, you can view our position paper on our website. So we have currently around 100 endorsers from 20 different countries and 60 different institutions. Anyone who would be interested to join us, please email me. And we are currently also networking or connecting to migrant think tanks, foundations, and nonprofits. Very briefly, our advisory board members. I'm giving also credit to them for several of the insights that I will share with you today. And this is also why I would like to present them very briefly. Three of them you know, and I will not go into detail. Mary O'Brien and Chris Brewster and Christina Gibson are all international business management scholars. Paul Baldassari is Vice Executive President at Flex. He used to be the former Chief Human Resource Officer of Flex. Flex is the third largest electronics manufacturing company. Alex Betts is Forced Migration Scholar at Oxford University. Kevin Franklin is Chief Operating Officer at Elevate. For those of you who don't know, Elevate is a leading consultancy on sustainability in global value chains. William Kerr is a Harvard professor and he specializes in skilled migration. Philip McCain is urban economist and professor at Sheffield University. Dilip Ratha is chief economist at the World Bank, and he is also responsible for the migration and remittances unit of the World Bank. And last but not least, Neil Wilkinson is the head of migrant worker programs at the Institute for Human Rights in Business. So, and now at the beginning of my presentation, as you couldn't see me, I started talking to you about changes in migration patterns with the intention to give migration its own identity. So, and I also emphasize that the percentage of migrants among the world population is currently 3.6%. Today, in preparation for my presentation, I checked the percentage in 1960. It means 61 years ago, it was 3.1%. The percentage of migrants among the world population went then down, and after 1980, it started increasing again. 2010, it was 3.1%. So you see the absolute number of migrants has increased, but the relative number is still fluctuating. And if you talk to migration scholars, they will tell you probably that centuries ago, the percentage of international migrants among the world population was higher than today. And this is why I emphasized changes in migration patterns that I believe, and also people I work with, have transformed the contemporary context in which multinational companies operate. And it has had implications for their activity strategies and decision-making processes. And I will elaborate upon three specific aspects now, and they are also related to the previous talk that we just listened to. And I would like to emphasize it's not a traditional presentation, so I will actually raise some bold, open questions that can serve also for a discussion, and questions that I believe haven't been addressed by the IB community yet. I could be wrong, yeah, but let me share them with you. So the first one is related to the changing nature of location and firm-specific advantages in light of access to human capital. Sui elaborated briefly on this, and also Lisa talked about refugees. So an internationally mobile, highly diverse talent pool, ever more accessible in many developed countries. This is what we are experiencing right now, what we see. Also, maybe to give you some numbers, 70% of all skilled migrants to OECD are going to only 4 destinations. And this is the UK, it's the United States, it's Canada, and it's Australia. 70% full skilled migrants to OECD. What these countries have in common is, first, they are English speaking, but they also score very high on universalism. And I think during my presentation at the beginning, I talked about this phenomenon of super diversity. And Sui also mentioned this during her presentation, the super diversity among migrants that we witness today. And this raises several issues for future research. So first, the diversity that characterizes migrants is distinguished by dynamic interplay of variables. Lisa talked about refugees. As we distinguish between skilled migrants, we distinguish between migrants are country of origin, destination they go to, countries they have lived in between, and so on. So what remains unknown is how the three intersecting contexts in which qualified migrants are embedded. Intersectional, characterized by different stigmas ascribed to migrant intersecting identities, organizational, characterized by firms' policies and practices, and societal, characterized by host country standards for equal treatment for integration of migrants, influence each other, is one probably question for future research that deserves more of our attention. Second one is related to the educational pathway, national immigration policies, and the recruitment and selection practices of firms. When you think about the United States, and when I think about the UK, I worked there 3 years ago, and the percentage of our international students, graduate students, was around 95%, which means that these students come to the UK, they study in the UK, and then many of them try to find employment in the UK, which means that they are directly accessible to companies operating in UK. So it's a huge global talent pool that's there. What recently made me think, now with COVID and work from anywhere future, and we have these discussions around, is work from anywhere future to stay? I start asking myself, is study from anywhere future to stay? At my current institution and my future institution, so I will be moving to University of Leeds this year actually. So there are discussions around introducing new online programs for students. So now, if there are new online programs introduced, which means that Chinese students can remain in China, obtain their degrees from somewhere else, obtain the knowledge, but remain in their country of origin, which means that they're directly accessible to Chinese multinationals, like, for example, Alibaba. What implications does it have for Western companies that are operating in the countries that traditionally or still very much benefit from the educational pathway? And last section related to this topic of more high-skilled and firm-specific advantages. And I think this is a question that might be of interest for scholars outside of field, migration scholars, and I think that we have the means to tackle this question. So migration scholars for years are trying to come up with a theory of migration. Why do people move? Why do people stay? Why don't people go? Where do people go? And now firms are actually also actively taking part in changing these migration patterns, redirecting them. And an interesting avenue for us to explore could be, how do actions of multinational enterprises affect global migration flows, and how do these flows in turn link to the economic advancement and location advantages of migrant receiving countries? I will go now, still research questions related to this topic, but it's on low-skilled migrants. And I'm emphasizing this because probably those of you who have heard me talk before, when we launched a special issue in Journal for Business, actually, when we had the call and we received back then 65 submissions, not a single submission of the 65 submissions was on low-skilled migrants. But low-skilled migrants actually are the majority. It's a smaller percentage of those who are highly skilled. And interesting aspects for us to explore in future are the codependencies and interactions between multinationals, government, and migrant workforce. And also right now with Industry 4.0, also the automatization. So what are the implications of changes in country-specific advantages, low-skilled labor for the production structure of the firm? Will these changes further reinforce the trends towards automatization? And will they increase multinational companies' reshoring efforts of jobs per se? I'm on purpose asking these questions. Will they increase multinational companies' reshoring efforts of jobs per se? Because recently, Migration and Business in Society, recently, it was in December last year, we have been approached by a big Austrian multinational company, and they want to reshore their production to Austria. But they approached us because they need help. They need 700 migrant workers, and they would like to have 700 migrant workers from the Philippines. And so our task would be to identify the 700 workers, find a way how to bring them to Austria. Once they are in Austria, facilitate their integration into the Austrian societies so that they can work in the factories of this big multinational. So it appears that reshoring efforts might also involve reshoring of jobs per se. Good. To the second issue, and it's related to also Sui's presentation, implications of migration for cross-border activities of firms. The emphasis so far in AIB, to the best of my knowledge, Shukla and John Canvell have a paper in GWB 2018 that I think it's a very good exception, but the emphasis has been on the knowledge carrier channel as the main mechanisms by which migrants influence foreign direct investment activities between their country of origin and country of destination. Now, if you remember at the beginning of my presentation of the topic migration, I raised the issue, I talked about political, economic, and social cultural impacts of migration in both migrant sending and migrant receiving countries. And the social cultural impacts are very key, because if you listen to migration scholars, they argue that transnational linkages have and are changing individual orientations. They are changing national cultural values and norms, and they are changing consumption patterns, and those all has implications also for IB. It's very well illustrated by this following quotation that I would like to read. It's by Alejandro Portes, is the most cited migration scholars, and he says, the combination of a cadre of regular transnational activists with the occasional activities of other migrants adds up to a social process of significant economic and social impact for communities and even nations. While from an individual perspective, the act of sending a remittance, buying a house in the migrant's hometown, or traveling there on occasion have purely personal consequences. In the aggregate, they can modify the fortunes and the culture of these towns and even of the countries of which they are part. So cultures are changing. Now think again about the changes in migration patterns. The number of skilled migrants has increased. Yeah, and these skilled migrants, when they go to their new destination, they are dispersed, which they have more influence to change internal structures, to change internal institutions. And they're also more
Aida, I'm sorry for interruption, but maybe just one very last point, because we're moving on to the questions. The last 30 seconds, please.
Okay, then I will present just one last question that's related to this, and I have just one final point. So, and it's related to the transnational perspective. So, which brings me to this question: is there a need to reconsider transitional distance and dimensional approaches to measuring culture in IB in light of changing patterns of global migration? And also, what about the awakening of potential benefits of international economic activity against the liability of foreigners? I will go now to my final slides with some very final thoughts, because I do think that this is important.
But very quickly, please.
It's very quickly. I said 281 million international migrants, 26 million refugees. Currently, I think IB efforts are on the skilled, not most, but majority. And there is a lot of research coming out on refugees. One aspect where I can't see anything, but I could have could be that I didn't come across, is the internal migrants. And maybe the question now is why internal migrants, what implications does it have for international business? But there are 763 million internal migrants. And when we talk to multinational companies operating, for example, in China, they will say the issues that they're facing with internal migration in China are the same as they are facing with international migration when it comes to bringing Nepalese workers from Malaysia. And this is my final issue, that I would like also to redirect some of the attention of the IB community to the internal migration. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Powerful messages. I think that's exactly where we should thank also all the presenters for sharing their thoughts, as well as our participants who are asking lots of questions here in the chat and the Q&A. So let's move to the Q&As. And actually, I would like to start by addressing one question to you, Lisa. It's in the chat and the Q&A, Smita asked you to clarify proposition 3B under the human capital. I was also very intrigued with exactly that proposition, particularly with your arguments around the fact that qualifications do not transfer. For example, just as a matter of a specific example here in Denmark, particularly under the very, tip of the COVID pandemic, there were not enough nurses and doctors in the Danish hospitals. Yet there were lots of nurses and doctors who didn't speak Danish, but they were fully qualified. They were, on the other hand, cleaning the floors and serving food somewhere because they couldn't actually work in and help Danish system, Danish medical services to deal with the pandemic. So again, human capital doesn't transfer. Is that what you're arguing?
Thank you. Yes, in some ways, absolutely yes. I want to indulge, and it's mean to share the screen, something that I didn't share earlier. It's downright unkind. Look at that, filling the screen. But I wanted to show the sites that we draw from and show that while I only spoke and repeated myself on a few of the common differences, as if that's all we relied on, I do want to share the screen to show the depth of support we have for some of these arguments. So let me maybe answer yours about human capital at the larger, and then the respondents or the participants' question about 3B. So first, yes, we actually said 3A is essentially, oddly, for some of this transferability of training and educational backgrounds and licensure, that actually immigrants and refugees are now sharing this common block because, again, of choices we make at institutional level in the receiving country. And so we said, look, we've spent this whole paper separating you two, and look at this deep column of separation. But we said, like, essentially 3A is, yes, there's a portion where refugees and immigrants will similarly face barriers and blocks that are so unfair given the training that we don't recognize and see. So let's move to the person who asked about 3B. And 3B, thank you for the attention to the detail. But our argument, I'm looking down at my paper briefly, so bear with me as I look away from the screen. But the argument here is that we actually have historical trends on even refugees who flee earlier versus later. People with a little more money, a little more training, they tend to have the ability to scan the environment. And even though they're involuntarily leaving, they may have more on their backs or more in their bags than people who leave later, who just don't have the freedom in their own home country or the resources. So, so we know that timing means people with higher human capital, as well as usually higher physical capital, can leave earlier. And there was actually a golden exile in Cuba where people and scholars have watched the timing and the human capital over time of some known exit corridors. So the other part, though, that's more central to 3B, 3B is saying, assuming that language is equal, instead of putting this on the screen, it says later refugees and those who lived for a long time in refugee camps are going to have more difficulty navigating human capital than new immigrants. And so something that I think Ari wrote in the comments for others to see is that I didn't really talk about the human capital losses that can happen when the average refugee stays about 5 years in a camp. And so even licensure, and of course you learn new skills, you learn different survival, you probably learn about bricolage, you probably learn about entrepreneurship, you learn massive new skills, but quantifiable human capital you had in your country of origin is lower. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so like with that, those who leave at later times, also data shows that they are going to spend longer than the average of 5 years in a refugee camp or temporary housing. So those who leave first with the higher human capital who are scanning the environment, they will be able to leave, and they'll also be able to be relocated faster than those who leave at later times. And so that also contributes to kind of the deleterious effect of that camp and being in that holding pattern for such a long time. So thank you for that question. That was really a great.
No, I think super interesting arguments, and I very much encourage our participants to go back and read the paper. There are lots of interesting the way the argumentations are built, so rich. And I think it's also partly because of the how fluent you guys were with the different kinds of theory on different levels. Like, for example, acculturation psychology is definitely very micro level, and then yet how introducing this argument into the traditional quote unquote macro level conversation. So obviously, this is one of the papers where we can see the clear advantages of multi-level reasoning in answering the question. And speaking of the this multi-leveling, so to say, Sui, there is also a question around your hypothesis too from the Covid, but I guess to remind them, I guess the audience, if you remember Sui's model, then there was those interactions between, for example, some of the individual level variables such as year and age. And I mean, when you start, Sui, when you answer the question around your age too, that very specific question, I was wondering if you could also take along perhaps broader questions like why only age and year, because maybe there, or definitely there are other individual level variables that could actually produce very interesting interaction and speak to this cross-level nature of interdependencies. Sui, let's start with H2 and then go to the broader question.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a great question. And if you remember, the first hypothesis is about individual embodiedness, individual factors. So we talk about, how long they stay in the country residence and the age derived the country of residence. And we believe, again, if you stay longer home residence, you're more embodied in home residence. And if you arrive younger, you're more embodied in your home country of residence. I would say, there's, this is a proxy to individual integration, individual embodiedness in the country of residence. But, our analysis is, blessed with this secondary data, but also constrained by the secondary data. So, many things is use proxy. So I think if, get, primary study, survey data, questionnaire, in-depth interview might have, you can repeat this exercises, look at, how to measure individual social embodiedness in the country of residence and see whether the results are consistent. And, but, again, I think, there could be many other, proxies. And also another question is whether you have family or friends in the country of residence, how that help you with your embodiedness in the country of residence. I think it needs further investigation. My own experience, it depends on individual heterogeneity, individual cognition factors, right? Having friends and family in the country of residence, new country, might help you to integrate, they might help you to further integrate and know the country of residence, but somehow you might say, oh, I have my friends and family, I have my circle. I don't need to know the country of residence. I don't need to make new friends. I don't need to, go out on my own, right? So I think the relationship could be more complicated. I think there's lots individual endogeneity in there, and and I think somehow for the study, use survey question interviews could provide more insights. I'm looking forward to this type of study. But thank you so much for the question.
But indeed, too, and I think this particular concept of social embeddedness and how you bring it into the research, I think it's super interesting. And your reflections around, it's not just about the individual per se, right? But also his or her interaction with, for example, networks. And that's exactly what Davina is actually writes in the Q&A when she kind of offers a bigger reflection, not related to particularly any of the papers here, but we are here discussing, broader agenda. And Davina actually also believes that, personal networks, so another kind of embeddedness, you could say, the embeddedness that the individual brings along could be definitely something that, would play with a kind of relations that you're identifying. I also believe, now Aida has talked about, migrants also in relation to the sustainable development goals, bringing the individual level variables among them, for instance, gender, would actually show this interdependency that we do have in SDGs, in different types of SDGs. So super promising concept of social embeddedness, and indeed a very interesting introduction to different kind of different level thinking. There is one question that is getting kind of attention in the Q&A, and that's a question from Milda. The question is actually for Lisa. Now that's a very long question, and I already asked Lisa to read it and make sense of that. So instead of me reading that long question, Lisa, what if I just give it the opportunity to you right now to answer it as you understand that? Obviously, you could say there is definitely something curious being unfolded in here. Lisa, please.
Yeah. Sure. I'm not sure everyone can see it. Is that partly what you're saying?
Although if you can summarize it very briefly.
Yes. I think the heart of Milda's question is that she's very nicely questioning one of our premises that is it true that refugees actually have less social capital as compared to immigrants, because we are starting to see with all the news sort of gratefully, helpfully putting attention on migration and refugee problems, that there are getting to be at least a perception that there are more agencies, more support, more stakeholders trying to help refugees. So is it really true? Is it such a fair question in light of, is the paper outdated? It's not what she said, but the question is it possible? And again, it's stated very nicely. The political urgency brings attention, and does that mean we have? So first, I would argue or share that most refugees are not given long-term support. So some of these organizations, they pop up with well-meaning. In fact, we have several studies where we looked at how they think they're doing it right and they're doing it wrong. So we learned that from staying in one agency for so long and seeing how refugees were not served by refugee-specific and intentions were high, but execution is poor. So that's part of it. Something unique that I'll share from that other paper is that organizations focus so much on helping refugees and immigrants integrate with the community, but they didn't help them start by integrating with each other. And then ultimately some assume that just because you're all from Syria, you therefore have enough in common to work together. And they didn't help them integrate with the wider community. They helped them just stay sort of Syrian centric. And so those are two extreme cases of where refugee specific organizations actually kept the refugees at more of a handicap than just across the street. Some immigrant oriented organizations who did separate intake really did provide a whole different set of experiences. That's just one city and one local example, but that's the bifurcation that we see. The intent is higher, the press is stronger, but there's a real need to kind of do it right.
So for example, the IRC, which is one of the largest refugee resettlement organizations in the United States specifically, only guarantees 90 days of support. And within those 90 days, it's emergent support, right? Shelter, food, housing, perhaps employment. But a lot of the times these organizations are so strapped for future help that these emergent needs are all that they can suffice. They don't really help to connect as much with the community that they would like to. I know that there's the will, but sometimes there's also these resource shortages. Another part of this social network that we need to also be very cognizant about is the difference between voluntary and involuntary migration status. Is that if I get to choose where I live and where I'm going to be resettled, I might choose a place where I know there's a diaspora. There is a network of others who are from my same culture, community, and so on and so forth. Refugees, the formal UN refugee process, you don't really get to say where you're going to end up, right? So for example, we worked with people who said, my goal was to go to Denmark, but now I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I don't know a single person here, and I'm the only person from Syria in the state, basically. And that happens a lot. And so again, because it's non-voluntary and because of the actual refugee resettlement process, because I don't get to say where I'm going, I could end up being the only Syrian in Salt Lake City. And that can be really hard to build those social networks again and to leverage that. And so again, social capital, while there are organizations to assist refugees that are specific to the refugee status, they're truncated, limited in resources and support, are time dependent. Usually about 90 days is the most that they can provide. And then I didn't get to choose where I go, so I don't get to choose to connect and to plug into existing diasporas or communities of people who I can build social network with. So thank you for that question. It's really good. And it's a great place to continue research, I think. And so
sounds good. Sui, I've noticed that you were nodding at that point. Do you see how, for example, the kind of, in your I don't want to say area, but that direction of your research, so to say, would that benefit from that quote unquote fight for disaggregation that is a purposeful introduction of that heterogeneity that we see in migrants? Do you see any immediate benefits in introducing that?
Absolutely. I think based on that, the government should have program or, before the immigrant even come to the country of residence, they should provide, resources, and let them know the importance to be embedded in the new society. I would say the refugee, question, I think there's definitely outliers. I know like in Canada and many other countries, the refugee, be adopted by a local family. And actually, I know Nicole Cavallo, when the Syrian refugee came to Canada, she said she adopted a family to live with them, support them. And, there's definitely outliers. In that, perspective, you might be more embedded in the new society because, you live in, a local family. And when I came to Canada, I lived with a Canadian family that helped me in a great deal and to be embedded in the society. So I think there's definitely an outlier, but as you mentioned, majority of refugees, when they come to the country, they don't have a choice. They might not be lucky enough to have the opportunity to be embedded in the society. And therefore, I think the government realized the importance of them to be embedded in the society, provide programs like, be adopted by, Canadian, I guess, new family, local family, native family, provide the program to, let them know the society, not just the language, the culture, the institutions, and all that are very important. And also that justifies some countries, they encourage international students to be immigrant, because the education process itself let them be embedded and make friends to the new society. And I think all that was very important. This is super important to the success of immigrants, either they're business owners, in being hired as, in their later integration as a career path in the new country of residence.
Oh, wonderful. And that's exactly what Aida was also talking about in one of her research questions that we've seen on your slides. But Aida, I know that you have a question for Lisa. Would you like to ask it yourself?
So thank you very much, also Sui and Lisa, for both presentations. I have a question because I really don't know, but I'm former refugee from Bosnia. So I experienced what it means to have to flee, to then move to a different country. And then Lisa, in your presentation, you talk about trauma. And then you talked about time duration, length. And sometimes you experience trauma, but it can take years that you start feeling really the consequences of the traumatic experience back then. So, for example, in my case, it happened when I was 12, but I really faced the consequences of the trauma of having to escape at the age of 35. So, which made me think the time dimension. Is this a valid indicator of, migrants' entrepreneur success or any type of successful integration into the society? I mean, trauma runs deep, and
it does. And actually, it was part of what I was I wanted to raise my hand to add to the final question. It's a transition topic as well, because I think trauma disproportionately, as we know, affects refugees. Therefore, trauma disproportionately affects the ability to create that social capital. It's the final piece of the answer to Milda as well, because as we saw at an individual level, like Aida is helping us go to, we saw refugee entrepreneurs at a farmer's market who would dive under the table when it was really just the backfiring of a car in the road, but it reminded them and re-triggered the combat memories, and so that made it so they couldn't continue a conversation with someone that they would have built social capital with had they not been coping with that and had that not manifested. So not only did you introduce trauma necessarily, Aida, but also you introduced time. And so let's talk about them together and separately. Time was a point of consternation as we tried to make the paper the best it could be. And because, as another question in the Q&A hints at, time, there's what you say you want to have happen when you arrive in the country, and there's what actually happens to you. There's what you say, how long you intend to be in a refugee camp, and then there's this terrible data about the averages. And so actually we started with intent, because as you recall, part of our work was directed at policy, and that was at the writing at the outset. That means that governments have to deal with what you state when you present. So we got around time or utilized it and anchored it in our paper, which is different than in the Q&A we can answer with more freedom. And so, yes, the book that we are all coming to know so well, The Body Keeps the Score, reveals that trauma can embed and is embedded in our body and will manifest against our will, sometimes without us even recognizing, naming, or labeling trauma. And it can happen from the moment we arrive to, as you are saying and sharing, possibly 20, 30 years later and more. And so, yes, in our discussion of the moderator of trauma, and we actually are building a whole line of research from papers, presentations, and books on trauma and entrepreneurship, trauma and refugees, because we think it's one of the most helpful ways we can guide policy and stakeholders, especially entrepreneurship.
This is wonderful observation, and you can see also introducing such you could say quote unquote non-usual consideration that in AIB research could also point out or open multiple other doors, in a sense is also what kind of activities migrants would go for, what kind of enterprises they will build, definitely their leadership style in the future and things like this. Just looking at the list of participants on today's webinar, there are definitely lots of us who not only on the research and professional level related to the topic of the conversation, but also on the personal, quite a few of us are working and living in other countries by choice or because life turned that way. So I would really like to thank you, our presenters and panelists, for initiating such important conversation, and I very much hope that's the beginning of wonderful conversation that not just moves forward research, but also actually affects people's life. For the audience, we will have to round up now because we are at 17:30 Copenhagen time. I'd like to thank you for your participation. I would encourage you once more to read the papers presented today and reach out to panelists who obviously continue in this work, in the book, in the project, in the network. I hope we can keep in touch. Thank you for those of you who also posted quite a few references in the chat. Have a look there. And for the whole AIB community, thank you for supporting this webinar series. There is definitely something you could start looking forward to. The GIPS Decade Award webinar will be taking place at the end of January, and then we have another webinar upcoming on the topic of family firms. So thank you for your support, and I'll see you at the future webinars. Goodbye.